Okay, all right. Welcome back to the Reclaiming Our Patrimony podcast with your hosts, Michael Tuig and Jude Burkett. It's nice to be back. Jude, how are we doing?
Hey, Michael. I'm doing great. Yeah, it's great to be back.
Yeah, looking good in your flannel.
Oh, well, thank you.
All right, so this episode is going to be a little bit of a different episode. So far, we've been discussing, I guess you could call it, topics that have to do with more current events or relatively current events, prompted by news articles or other more modern sort of writings. Like last time in our cannibalism episode, we talked about, or that discussion was based off of a New York Times article that had been written probably about a month ago by now. But this time, for this episode, we decided we're going to do something a little different. This episode is going to be a little bit shorter than the previous ones and will hopefully be a series diving into a book. And this is not a modern book. This is, or at least the book we're going to be discussing first in this series, is The Consolation of Philosophy by Boethius. So I guess for anybody in the audience who has never heard of The Consolation of Philosophy before, or only knows a little bit, maybe has heard the name but doesn't know what it's about, doesn't know who Boethius is. Boethius was a late antique Roman politician, intellectual, philosopher, theologian, man of letters. He was a little bit of a Renaissance man. He's most famous for his philosophical writings, so his most famous work is The Consolation of Philosophy. He did write a lot of other things, several theological tracts. He was also a big translator. He knew Greek, which in his time period, so late antique Rome, this is roughly the 5th century when he lived. Most Romans didn't know Greek by this point in their history, and he was one of the few educated Romans who was so well educated that he knew Greek. And one fun fact about him is that he undertook a project to translate all of the famous Greek philosophical works from Greek into Latin. Needless to say, he didn't live long enough for him to even come close to finishing that. But what he did translate a few. He translated a few works of Neoplatonic philosophy, and he did translate a few of Aristotle's philosophical works, which is highly important, actually, because his translations are some of the only Latin sources of Aristotle's philosophy that the early Middle Ages had access to until the 12th century, when Latin philosophers started, or Western philosophers who knew Latin started translating Muslim translations of Aristotle in the 12th century. So Boethius kind of provided that link with Aristotle, making sure that people didn't forget about Aristotle for about 600 years. So even in just that regard, he's pretty important. But also in his own lifetime, he was a politician. Without going too much into the history of late antique Rome, by this point in time, Rome was under the control of the Ostrogoths. So King Theodoric was the Ostrogothic king in charge of Rome, but he still kind of maintained most of the forms of Roman government that he inherited. So there was still a Senate, there were still councils, there were still all of those Roman offices. They didn't have as much power as they once did, but they were still relatively important. And Boethius held a lot of those positions. He was a consul at one point. At one point in his career, he was very much trusted by the king. He was very well regarded, very successful, wealthy. So, in other words, for much of his life, he kind of had it all. Until he didn't, and which is the context out of which his book is birthed, because at some point in his career, and the details, historical details for this are kind of fuzzy. Basically, he was implicated in a conspiracy of some of the senators, Roman senators, against King Theodoric. It's unclear if he was actually part of the conspiracy, if he was just sympathetic to it, or if he had nothing to do with it. Either way, some people accused him of trying to work for the downfall of King Theodoric, and King Theodoric wasn't having any of it. Also, their religious persuasions didn't help. Boethius was a Catholic Orthodox Christian, so he believed he was a Trinitarian Christian. King Theodoric and the Ostrogoths were Arians, so they were, in the eyes of Boethius, they would have been heretics. And King Theodoric was also, by this point in time, wary of any sort of opposition from Orthodox Christians who could have been seen as potentially disloyal. So, keeping all that in mind, basically, Boethius was exiled from Rome. He was imprisoned, and after a few years in imprisonment, he was executed. So, the trajectory of his life goes from, becoming very successful, very wealthy, having basically anything he could want, and then completely falling from grace, being imprisoned, derided, and then ultimately executed. I guess one final fun fact is that, and I'm surprised a lot of Catholics aren't aware of this, but Boethius is actually a saint. He's considered a martyr, actually.
I mean, I didn't know he was a saint until today. So.
Yeah. So you can pray for his intercession, which is interesting. He's considered a martyr.
Do you know what is the patron saint of, by chance?
I have no idea. I do know that he's a local cult in Italy. So I don't know. It's some Italian city, maybe Pavia or something like that. But anyways, fun fact: he's a saint. So we should properly be calling him Saint Boethius. But with that, yeah. So that's just a little brief historical background, and all that's actually very important for this book, The Consolation of Philosophy, because. And Jude will get into like the structure of the book, and we'll get into like what it's even about, generally speaking. But he wrote The Consolation of Philosophy while he was imprisoned. So this is a product of his imprisonment. This is basically him reflecting on his life, and with the knowledge that he's almost certainly going to be executed. So it's important to keep, that's a pretty important detail to keep in mind while reading this book at all. But yeah, Jude, now Jude's going to talk about the structure of the book a little bit, just because that also sheds some light on how to even read it and understand it.
Yeah, so I guess it's sort of got a like a monologue, or has a monologue and a dialogue component. So, so there's the character Lady Philosophy, who comes to Boethius, and essentially she comes when he's sick, and she's sort of, I guess she's sort it's sort of almost Socratic, where she's sort of questioning him, and trying to draw out the deeper truths of things. So there's that component, but then there's also the poetry as well. So often each book will start with some poetry. I don't think that's true of every book, but it'll start with some poetry, and I think it's supposed to operate sort of like how the chorus in Greek tragedies operates, where it's kind of giving distance from like the the main body of the work, giving the reader distance. I think it also said that it kind of serves as like a reprieve almost for Boethius, who's is like doing the hard philosophical work, and then he gets like a reprieve from it with the poetry. And the introduction mentioned how sort of the frequency of the poetry decreases as Boethius sort of is made more well as the book progresses. Their poetry is used less frequently. So yeah, that's sort of how the book is structured. Yeah, I don't know if you have anything else you want to add.
It makes total sense, but like poetry acting as reprieve, because for the audience out there, if you've ever read any philosophical works, especially
it can be pretty
more modern they get, like philosophical works can be horribly dry and boring.
Yeah.
So the fact that he kind of intersperses poetry, which is a lot more pleasurable to read than just big chunks of philosophical text, makes it a lot more maybe digestible.
Also, the dialogue as well makes it quite a lot easier to read than maybe somebody would say like the Politics by Aristotle or something.
Oh gosh. Or the Summa. Oh man.
Oh yeah.
If you've ever read the Summa, like I love Thomas Aquinas, but reading the Summa it can be.
Yes,
it can be a slog.
Yeah, I think it's worse. At least in my opinion, it's worse than the Politics or the Ethics for sure. Even
yeah.
As far as
I think. I think that's all to say that like the Consalation of Philosophy is definitely, at least insofar as it's a philosophical work, it's definitely easier to read than say like a Summa or, God forbid, Meditations by Descartes.
Can't say I've ever read that, but
I
mean, it's definitely
you'll hate every minute.
Yeah, it's similar to the Platonic dialogues, the dialogues of Plato, I would say. I think he's heavily influenced by Plato, right? So, not sure if that's where he gets his style from, but it does have that same sort of like it reads similar, I guess.
Yeah, well, that would probably be a safe assumption, because I don't know if you could be educated in the ancient world and
without
without having read Plato.
Yeah.
So that, I think that would probably be a safe assumption. So that's the structure of the book. So it's kind of it reads kind of like a philosophical tract, but also not really in a lot of ways. It also reads, again, as we've been saying, like a dialogue. It's a lot more. It's very personal. It is a little bit like a memoir almost, and this ties back with his kind of life, because it's very much he's in the book that he wrote. He's one of the characters.
If you think about like Aristotle, he's not in his works, so it's
it's very impersonal.
And St. Thomas, those are both very just like looking at the facts or whatever, just doing philosophy. But this is like you said, very personal. He's in his works. You kind of learn a little bit about his life almost. Like what he's been through.
Yeah, in fact, I think historians
definitely
know a lot about his life from this book.
Yeah, exactly.
Because like he does, like, and we're gonna get into this. This episode will be about the first book, should check this beforehand. There's 5 books that make up the Constellation philosophy, and each book is split into 5 or 6 chapters, maybe 7. So we're going to be covering the first book, and the first book is essentially he lays out his life for Lady Philosophy. To give a brief overview of the first book, he's sick. He's imprisoned. He's sick because he's imprisoned, and he's grieving the fact that he's lost everything. And so it is essentially his autobiography. He's imprisoned. He's been unjustly accused. He's lost everything. And Lady Philosophy appears and essentially asks him, like, why are you sad? And then he spends several chapters going like, do I really need to explain why I'm sad? Okay, well, here are all the reasons I'm sad. I'm imprisoned. I've lost my fortune. Everybody hates me. I'm probably going to get executed. And to top it all off, like, I've just tried to be a good person my whole life, and this is my reward. And these evil people who have put me in the situation in the first place seem to be the ones who are winning. And then that's where it kind of leaves off, is Lady Philosophy starting to answer his objections. So I guess we're not going to get into like the nitty gritty details of the book. That's for you guys to read the book. So we're not going to be explaining every single page. But there are a few things that we thought we'd draw out. A few like bigger points, maybe some of the bigger themes that Boethius at least begins to bring up in the first book that he's going to develop later on. And one of them is one of the big ones. Well, actually, one of the big ones, if not the biggest one, is the idea of free will and providence kind of operating at the same time. And I don't know, Jude, would in his position, if you were in his position and someone just came up to you and told you, why are you so mad, bro? Like, God's in control of history.
That would not be as satisfying.
What would be your first reaction?
I would be like, it'd be irritating. It'd be like the person's kind of like almost belittling it. It would feel like, maybe like your circumstance. You're like,
well, I mean, like you're in his position. You're gonna die. You've lost your fortune. You've lost your good name. You're imprisoned. You don't have access to your beloved books. And then someone, actually like starts getting mad at you, saying, you shouldn't be mad at all. Why are you upset?
Yeah, that would be very, it'd be very upsetting for sure. Like,
but then the response to that is, well, but hold on, Jude. That's what we believe as Catholics, right? Is that God has control of history, right? Providential control of history. So how do you square those two things?
With some difficulty, I suppose, or maybe not difficulty, but the bright understanding of what does it look like for God to be in control, I guess. Like, what does that actually mean? Mm-hmm. It might not seem like God's, like when you're Boethius there, you've done everything right in life, and then you get accused and you're innocent. I guess he's presumably innocent, and he gets accused, and he's thrown in jail. What does God being in control mean? That might be different than like it working out the way we think it should work out for ourselves.
Mm. Yeah, no, I'm just looking at one quote on page 12 where he's reflecting on this problem. It's, again, fundamentally, how do you square free will, God's providence, and the seeming like success of people who are doing evil things at the expense of people who are trying to be good. And he has this to say, which is actually a little bit shocking, but he says, it may be part of human weakness to have evil wishes, but it is nothing short of monstrous that God should look on while every criminal is allowed to achieve his purpose against the innocent. So, I mean, he's essentially saying that it's monstrous that God should allow wicked people to prevail over innocent people, because, again, it's very personal. It's what's happening to him right now. Presumably, I mean, presuming that he's a good person, and if he's a saint, then presumably he was a good person, or at least tried to be.
But I guess that's just like the nature of free will. Like, is it really God letting, or can you think? I don't know if you can think about it as God letting people, like, letting the wicked do evil acts, because that kind of makes it seem like God's kind of like he has control of you. He lets you do certain things. So like you're a puppet and all the strings are tight, but then he like lets a few loose and you can kind of do whatever you want there, but like the rest is still restrained. What it seems like.
Huh. Mm-hmm.
So I don't know if, I guess in a sense, God is letting you do evil acts in the sense that you have free will to do whatever you want, in a sense.
Well, I mean, I've never. Maybe this is good that it's happening right now. I don't know if I've ever sat down and just thought about what free will even means, but like when you think about it, there's an all-powerful, omnipotent, omniscient God who created the entire universe. And he's also all good, all justice, goodness, truth, beauty. Creates a universe that is completely separate from him, and that's good. And then he creates these creatures called human beings who can somehow, who have the capacity to choose whatever they want. But God is all good, but by definition, if we have free will, we can choose that which is not good. So like, how do
because God only creates good.
Yeah. But then, and then it's also the question, like, could God have created a universe of free creatures who didn't commit evil? Is that even possible?
Well, I guess we're going to use this is the I think it's the Augustinian understanding of evil, where it's the absence of good, right?
Mm-hmm.
So if the world is if whatever God creates is good, then is man like making an absence of good somehow? Like,
But then how do you even
where does
make an absence? What does that mean?
yeah, how do you create, like, how do you take away something? Like, make something become nothing almost. Like, humans can't do that.
Right. Well, and like, how can you choose something that, like taking that definition, evil as a privation, how can you choose something that by definition is not there? Or like,
Yeah.
uh, it's a really strange way of putting it, but I don't know. And I mean, it kind of goes back to the question too of like, not just like how did God do it, but why in the first place would God create a universe in which evil was even a possibility?
I guess, yeah. I mean, we understand that God created us to love Him, right?
Right.
And the only way to truly love is if you can be free to not love, to reject, I guess.
Right. Well, I mean, like,
I guess evil is
like
rejecting
if
God.
you held up a gun to someone's head and said, "Love me or else," I mean, the person is going to say that they love you so that they don't get shot. But is that actually love? I assume not.
Why? Well, why would you have? Why do you have to hold up a gun to make them love you? If it was,
Well, exactly. Yeah, exactly.
oh,
I mean, if they really loved you, then you wouldn't have to threaten them unless they didn't love you. At which point, But that's where the freedom comes in. Like, in order for love to be real, it has to be a free choice. So,
yeah.
like, I mean, like, the why question, it can kind of be boiled down to why is there free will? Why does God allow evil? Ultimately, I think it boils down to because He is love, and in order for creatures to actually be capable of love, they need to be able to choose the opposite of that.
So I think evil actually then is a result of freedom. That's where evil comes from, or only possible because of freedom. If God creates
Right.
everything good, where does evil come from?
Mm-hmm.
The only thing the only thing I can see that can change is like the free will that we have to choose, like to reject God, I guess. But yeah, I think free will exists so we can love God.
So, in that case, then, what about the fact that He's still suffering, though? Right.
So
and he's also not evil. He's again with the assumption that he's someone who's been striving to be good, and he's suffering because of it. That doesn't seem very fair.
Well, so it's I think it's and I think it gets to it later on in the book, but
yeah. And for context, like, these are like the questions are being raised in the first book, but they aren't answered until later on. So a lot of these answers are just being left kind of vague for a reason.
Right. I think it's like, I guess, so, he's striving for holiness or whatever, and he's been a good person, but he's still suffering. I guess it's the question, like, what lens do you like? What lens are you looking through when you see, like, what does it mean? What does it mean if you lead the good life? What is the result? Does that mean that you're gonna have like the physical, like, you're gonna have wealth and your existence is gonna and all that. Is that what the good life entails? So it's like there's a disconnect or a misunderstanding, I think, of like,
so maybe
he's done everything right, but it doesn't.
Yeah. And I mean, it is really easy to fall into that way of thinking.
So here's what,
in general.
Right. Yeah. Like, what's the end? Well, Lady Philosophy asks him, what is the end of man? She asks him, what is the true nature of man? And he's like, oh, it's a rational and mortal animal.
Which is such a nerdy answer.
I mean, yeah.
It might be. I mean, it's true, but like, is that?
I mean, he's a bit of a
like
nerd.
something to live by?
I mean, he's the one that was going to try to translate all of all of the ancient philosophers.
Yeah. So, yeah, that's
if he hadn't maybe, yeah, maybe if he had more time, he didn't get thrown in prison. We wonder what his social life was like. Probably.
Ouch. Well, I think at some point he complains about not having access to his library. Or like,
oh, that is another.
He says he says something about his library, like, or maybe it's Lady Philosophy saying, like, you don't need to be in a library to like think about philosophy. Something like that.
Of course, it has to be in his library.
Yeah. Of course,
but so here's a little. This is like what I was saying, kind of like, how are you actually how are you looking at life? What's the lens? And like here it says, Lady Philosophy says, and it is because you don't know the end and purpose of things that you think the wicked and the criminal have power and happiness. So I guess, what is the end of man? You need to understand that before you decide whether or not, like, I mean, if you know what the end of man, like, if the end of man is pleasure, leisure, having wealth, then obviously he's not doing very well off, and he's been doing everything right. So clearly, the end of man then is not those things,
right?
So I think that's what we're basically trying to get at.
And even like suffering too is that, like, proper, like, if you have whatever the end that Lady Philosophy is talking about, if you have that proper understanding of the end, that's going to inform the way you view your entire life, and you'll be able to find a place for suffering, and for being unjustly accused, as in his case, and kind of losing everything. Now, kind of switching tacks a little bit, but another interesting thing, and this is more just of a throwaway line that they kind of include, but it does have, it has to do with everything that's been talked about. But Lady Philosophy has this, like, almost seem like two throwaway lines where she says, page 8, the sole cause of their tragic sufferings, and this is in reference to other philosophers who were either tortured or killed for standing for the truth, or otherwise living good lives. The sole cause of their tragic sufferings was their obvious and complete contempt of the pursuits of immoral men, which my teaching had instilled in them. It is hardly surprising if we are driven by the blasts of storms, when our chief aim on the sea of life is to displease wicked men. And I find that really kind of interesting, because on the face of it, you'd think Lady Philosophy, that that's not true. That, you know, the point of our lives is not to like piss bad people off. Essentially, isn't the point of our lives to like love God and love our neighbor as ourselves? But kind of as we were talking about this beforehand, and if you think about it in a certain way, it does actually make sense, because and it fits like with what Boethius himself was experiencing. He tried to live a good life. He tried to be virtuous. He tried to be a just public official. He tried to do things right, etc., etc. And he made a lot of enemies, clearly.
Yeah.
But it's not that he like went out of his way to piss them off. It's that just by the very fact of the way that he was living, he angered them.
Right. Yeah. And I think we talked about that, like, you know, why is this the case that, you know, the quote unquote wicked people are displeased. They're almost like universally. It's almost like a universally true thing that like good people displease the wicked. It's like, why is that? Like, you know, like why? Well, there's so many martyrs, obviously, like in the church. Like, you know, they're good
Right.
people, and then wicked
who don't
people
really do anything. It's like
it's not like they're
like,
provoking people.
Yeah, like
But
the Carmelites of Company. Just to use one example, like they were just contemplative nuns who happened to live during Revolutionary France.
yeah,
Like, they're contemplative nuns. They're just praying in their convent, and then, you know, they refuse to sign off on the the civil constitution of the clergy, or one of the documents of the French Revolution. They refuse, and during the Reign of Terror, they were guillotined. All 16 of them, or however many there were. But I mean, it's not like they just kind of existed. And
well, yeah, well, that's the thing. They existed in a certain way, and it's a threat too. So yeah, it gets to some sort of like objective way of living. There's an objective standard that we're all, I guess, held to, whether we like it or not. But the wicked, I guess, sort of, maybe it's deep down they know that what they're doing is wrong, and so that when they see someone acting how one ought, then they can't stand it. They can't because they're kind of, I guess, they're failing, you know.
Yeah.
And no,
it's almost like it's like just seeing a person who's living the opposite way than you. If you know deep down what you're doing is perverted or bad, it's like the person doesn't even need to say anything for that to be a sort of like condemnation. So like, I think, you know, think of like, I'm thinking like the modern LGBTQ movement, how it's moved from just toleration to affirmation, where now like it's not enough that we just tolerate gay marriage or, you know, whatever the new perversion is of the day. It's that we have to say it's good. So it's not just tolerate it, like, oh, okay.
Now you have to actively
promote it. And that kind of feeds into that whole psychology of like, it must be that like when homosexuals see a healthy like married couple family, they must know deep down that like that's good. That's what's actually good.
I mean, well, if you think about it, just like very specific, the homosexual thing, that goes against nature, like our nature. So it's like
and biology.
Yeah. So it definitely stands to reason that there would be something, whether or not they would never admit it, of course, like out loud, but deep down, yeah, there's something that there has to be a disconnect there between what they say and what they actually believe or what they think in reality. I don't know.
Yeah, no, for sure. And maybe it could be. I wonder, would that fall under cognitive dissonance? Potentially.
Yeah, I was actually just thinking that whether or not. I think what is the definition of cognitive dissonance? Like what you hold when reality and what you believe don't coalesce. There's like you have a cognitive dissonance.
Yeah.
I think that's what it is. So yeah.
Then I think that would probably fall. Yeah.
Yeah.
Because like all of nature is screaming to the homosexual that this is not natural. But it's like it's a psychological, intellectual belief. So it's just
it's
those two things don't line up.
Mm-hmm.
And that would probably make somebody mad.
Yes.
It is, I guess the final thought that we had about this was just if we're to take this as true, and I think it is true after having talked about it, then it would seem to me that to be a good person almost necessarily seems to imply that you're probably going to have enemies, and that's not a bad thing.
Yeah, like in a perfect world, maybe no, but we don't live in a perfect world, so.
Oh, really? This isn't a perfect world.
Yeah, I hate to break it to you guys. Reality check.
But yeah, like as you're saying, in a perfect world, like everybody is gonna get along and will each other's good, but that's just not the case. So obviously, that's not to say like intentionally go out trying to piss people off. But at the same time,
like, how are you doing it? I guess.
Yeah,
like,
exactly. If you're pissing people off just because you're being a good person and just by the very fact that you're existing,
that's almost a good thing.
Yeah, that's almost a good thing. That
sounds wrong. Like it is, I guess. I mean, just
by I mean, like if someone like becomes your enemy because they hate the fact that you give alms and pray and are kind to everybody, that almost seems like a very strange form of compliment.
It's like an affirmation.
It's almost like a confirmation of what you're doing is actually good. Like you're doing a good job.
Yeah. Well, if you, we definitely mentioned this too before, but like with some of the is it Saint Anthony of the Desert when like he had demonic attacks, right? Like and they're like they became more severe, I think, as he like progressed. So it's like the more holy you become, the more you're targeted by the demons. Makes sense, kind of. There's the same way, like the better you are, the more people are going to dislike you.
Yeah. Oh no, that's good, because people can act like demons. Demons are just wills and intellects, and we have wills and intellects. So,
right.
I think so. Maybe it is. I wonder if it's like you're the math guy. What would it be? Like the more you increase in holiness, a direct relationship, the more
holy
evil people are going to hate you. Which might also be something to consider if you're trying to be a good person and you see that like everybody likes you. Like maybe you gotta try to work a little bit harder. about being a good person.
Yes, it's like keep track of it. No. Start collecting data. How many people hate you? It's not much.
How many people hate me, and why do they hate me? And if they hate me for like,
Because I
if they hate me for a reason that doesn't
cut
make
them
sense,
off in traffic.
Yeah. Okay. I don't think that's an example of virtuous behavior, Jude.
No.
Even though you might do that, but hate to break it to you.
We don't need to talk about that.
All right. Well, I think this pretty much wraps up book 1. It's essentially, in 10 seconds, it's Boethius complaining about his lot in life, and Lady Philosophy coming in and saying, I'm about to explain to you why you shouldn't be complaining about your lot in life.
Yeah.
And that's kind of where it leaves off. So, yeah, this wraps up book 1. And hopefully in a couple of weeks or so, haven't picked out a date yet, but we will do a follow-up episode talking about book 2.
Yeah. Oh, I know we talked about putting a poll out at some point. We should.
Yes.
Yeah, we could put a poll out. Just see what you guys think about doing like, doing what we're doing right now, talking about books. If that's something of interest or.
And we could put out some other like topic category ideas.
Yeah.
See what there's the most interest in, like current events, more historical topics, random things like cannibalism and other.
Yeah, so like more current event stuff.
Yeah.
I think that would be on. I think YouTube you can put polls up. So we're on YouTube, by the way. And then also I think Spotify as well. So look for it there.
Yeah, I know you can make a survey on Spotify. So
yeah.
Okay, we shall do that. But thank you guys for listening, and this has been Reclaiming Our Patrimony podcast. Next time.